Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Paloma Mejia. I'm the executive director of the Florida Brewers Guild. With us, we have Mo. He's a representative from Fermentis, and he's going to do a talk about the lager yeast 3470. We'll have this meeting recording the whole time, and we'll post it on the YouTube. We'll send you guys the link if you want to see it later also, or share it with your team.
Perfect.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that you can ask questions in the chat and then we can throughout the presentation, and then when Mo has the time, he'll answer the questions you guys have.
Perfect. All right. And make sure you're on your best behavior because this meeting is being recorded. So, well, thank you everybody for joining. This was a lot of people said that they wanted to see this presentation, didn't get a chance to because of the timing and stuff. And so, thank you to Paloma for letting me present it again. I think it's a good presentation with a lot of interesting information. Like Paloma said, if you have any questions, please chat them into the chat. Normally I answer these during the presentations, but I think when we do it on webinars, it turns into a mess. So, and I'll be happy to answer questions on this topic or any other Fermentis related topics towards the end. So, all right, we're going to get started. So, SafLager W-3470, this is the most widely used lager strain in the world. So, mute this out of the way. There we go. Now, so this presentation is going to cover the influence of operational parameters and fermentative performance on sensory characteristics. So, we're all brewers here, so I mean, I think we can all kind of agree. Typically, a lager, what you're looking for in a lager yeast is a generally neutral profile. You can have some fruitiness there, right? But you're not looking for phenolics. You really want a strain that's going to allow the hops and malt and really your process as a brewer, right, to shine. People always say that lager is the most difficult beer style to brew. Personally, I actually think it's relatively easy to brew. It's just hard to hide your mistakes behind, right? Like if you have a really good process, when you brew a lager, people can tell. And if you don't, well, you probably have some work to do. So here, at Fermentis, we like to talk about fermentation as a three-dimensional world. The first dimension is going to be your yeast characteristics, right? And that's things that are inherent to the yeast strain. So, for example, a Hefeweizen strain is inherently going to have an isoamyl acetate and 4-vinyl glycol, like banana clove character. A strain might be diastatic, another strain might be neutral. So strain selection is always important. And 3470 might be our most popular lager strain, but we have 4 other lager strains, soon to be 4 others. So yeah, there's a lot of choices you can make there as well. On the operational parameter dimension, these are things that are in our control as a brewer. So that's going to be your temperature, your pH, your nitrogen content. That's something that brewers don't think about enough, I think, but that's a huge factor in beer sensory and fermentation performance. Finally, you have your interaction with other ingredients. So this is going to be things like biotransformation, for example, right? Certain yeast strain releasing sensory compounds from hops and just the way terpenes and the other ways that malt, for example, and yeast might interact. Yep. Now, for this study, this is one of our characterization studies, and we did 14 different fermentations for this. So we had one big batch of wort split 14 ways, diluted down to different gravities. So we did 12, 16, 20 Plato. And remember these numbers 12, 16, and 20 makes things easier. So 12, 16, 20 Plato, and I put the gravity there for you there for those of you who prefer that. 12, 16, 20 C, which is 54, 61, and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. And then our pitch rates were 25, 50, 100, and 200 grams per hectoliter. So this was 100% Pilsner malt. It was 28 BU done with isoalpha acids. And sorry if I'm losing my voice a little bit. I'm coming off the back end of a cold. So, and these were direct pitched. So there was no oxygen. It was just directly pitched straight into the wort, no rehydration. Right? These were also 50-liter batch sizes. So you don't have to remember all this. These are all the fermentations. We didn't do every single option, but you're going to see 12, 16, 20 Plato. in gravity, the 12, 16, 20C, and then the pitch rates as well. These will be broken down later, but it kind of just gives you an idea of the number of different fermentations we did. So the first section we're going to cover here is volatiles. Now, these are measured compounds. So we took all these finished fermentations, we plugged them into lab equipment, so GC, and we measured the actual ppms of esters, of higher alcohols, etc. So looking at this chart, you'll see kind of the total concentrations of some of these compounds. This is the volatile alcohols. So for those of you that might not know what a threshold is, a threshold, and you're going to see these flavor units here. So this is an important part to understand, and it'll make everything else easier. Threshold is a term in sensory that's used to describe when a compound is going to be detected by 50% of the population. So, for example, the threshold of isoamyl acetate, I think, is about 2 to 3 ppm in a beer. And that 2 to 3 ppm of isoamyl acetate, 50% of a sensory panel will be able to identify it, right? So that doesn't mean that if something's above threshold, it automatically, in the case of isoamyl acetate, tastes like banana. Or if it's just below it, that it doesn't, right? It just means that 50% of a population might start to detect it. And taking something like isoamyl acetate, you might not get that banana character until you're like 6 times threshold, right? Or 4 times threshold. Just a hint of isoamyl acetate might just come off as an overall fruitiness. Um, so what we did here is we took the concentration, which is the top chart, we divided it by the published threshold, and that published threshold is just what's in the literature, right? And that gave us flavor units or odor units. Now, the reason that's important is because different compounds have different thresholds. So isoamyl acetate might have a threshold of like 2 or 3 ppm, but ethyl acetate might be 20 or 30 ppm. So just because you have 10 times as much ethyl acetate doesn't mean it has a more significant impact on the flavor profile. So this flavor unit, what it does is it kind of puts everything on an even playing field as far as how much it affects your palate, all right, or how much it affects sensory. I'm going to switch here. This is actually the first time I do this as a webinar. So does that make sense to everybody? Do you guys understand that? Yep. So I think it's an important thing to know. So the flavor units is really a measure of the impact that it's going to have on your actual sensory compounds. So anyways, as you can see here, the flavor units chart, which is this bottom one, and you can see 1 is the threshold. So anything that's above 1 is just above threshold, and everything that's below is just below. Now this chart, it only goes up to 2.5. I mean, we have some of our presentations, like we have one on WBO6, which is used for wheat beers and Belgian ales, that goes up to a 6, right? So overall, when you look at all these 14 different fermentations, they're all right around the same level, right? Some are maybe just above 0.5. One is at almost 1.5. So you have the span of within a range of 1 flavor unit, right? For isoamyl, this is isoamyl alcohol, sorry, that's above threshold. Everything else is below. Now, here it is broken down even further. So these are just the ones that were above threshold, technically. And then you could see the correlation charts here, which are really interesting. So the correlation for isoamyl alcohol was mostly correlated to density. So as you guys know, this would be a positive correlation. So as gravity went up, your concentration of isoamyl alcohol tended to go up as well. And this is a good correlation. It's a moderate correlation. You have a pretty weak correlation here, whereas pitch rate went up, your isoamyl alcohol went up as well. Now, keep in mind that we didn't do every single possible fermentation for the study. There would have been a lot more than 14. So there's probably some other confounding things to keep in mind, like we didn't use the lowest possible pitch rate in our study with the highest possible gravity and vice versa, right? But overall, we tried to do fermentations that were realistic to what a brewer might do. But overall, this is how these trended. So, but overall, it's really a flat performance. Like usually when we see these fermentations, you see big peaks and valleys. So next up, these are the esters, same thing as before. And this is why I did that whole spiel on the flavor units. As you can see here, ethyl acetate is by far the highest concentration ester in solution. However, ethyl acetate has a very high threshold. So you need a lot of it to be able to smell it. And when you look at it converted to these flavor odor units, you can see that the impact of ethyl acetate is not even really on the charts. I mean, it might have some synergistic effects with some of these other esters, but overall, the important esters here are the isoamyl acetate in orange and the ethyl hexanoate in blue. But they're important in the sense that they're the most present, that they're the highest concentration, but they're not important as far as a flavor impact. Because you can see, every single one of these fermentations is a very similar, flat performance as well across the board. So there's very little difference. And again, here, going further, you can see again, you know, very little above threshold. So overall, you have a pretty minor impact of esters and higher alcohols with 3470 at all these fermentations. It's pretty impressive. I mean, when you think about like some of these fermentations, for example, um, like C6 over here, which is one of the ones that's slightly above threshold, that's 20 Plato, right? 20 C, which is 68 Fahrenheit. That was pitched at 68, fermented at 68, held at 68, no alcohol, no oxygen, and we pitched 50 grams per hectoliter, which is really we recommend 80 to 120 grams per hectoliter, typically for fermentations at 12 C and above. So if you're pitching below 54, we actually recommend pitching a little bit more. But as you can see, it really didn't have much of an impact. And most of it has to do with gravity as well. Like the 20 Plato fermentations tend to be higher. So C13 is 20 Plato, C6, 20 Plato, C7 is 16, which is in the middle of the road, right? But overall, it wasn't, there's plenty of these higher temperature fermentations that are below, have the reduced as well. So what we saw in this analysis overall is that the esters and higher alcohol, and we actually see this kind of in most of our strains and pretty much everything I've seen in our characterization studies so far, that gravity is actually one of the biggest dials you can turn to increase or decrease esters and higher alcohols. So you go back to the screen. It's weird to not see your faces. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions real quick? If you do, type them into the chat. But I'm going to keep going from here. So that was a measured compound side, and I think that's an interesting kind of oh, what did I do? Okay, that's an interesting thing to look at because it's objective. We took finished beer, we put it into equipment, and we measured exactly what was there. It's not up for debate, really. Now, this is an interesting part too, because one of the most sensitive, although subjective, one of the most sensitive and important, I think the most important measure you have as a brewer in a brewery is sensory. Now, we run a pretty awesome sensory panel at Fermentis at the headquarters in France, and you can see a picture of it down here. These are all like these booths that pop up, and you have, I think it's 60 different tasters, they told me last. Colleen, who runs it now, she has a PhD in this, like in sensory. So she knows her stuff. And it's her job to train all these different people to try and make it as objective and as unbiased as possible. So they'll do, this is an example of the sheets that they'll get. You have none to high and fruity, phenolic, sulfury, etc. And they'll run these, I think, so for this study, now it's a lot more. This presentation is a few years old, but they do 22 trained tasters, so and 3 repetitions. And there's the data plots for this are like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different data that are all averaged out, and then it spits out the sensory information. So going here, you can see these are all the fermentations again, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the spider chart. So you have 0 to 8, and everything in the middle is less impactful on sensory. Everything towards the 8 is a stronger sensory result or response from the panel. And you can see it's actually a pretty consistent performance here. It overlaps a lot, which a lot of times these spider charts, they have a lot of variance. You can maybe see a tiny difference here in body. The big one is right here in other off notes. And you can see this, that's definitely a discrepancy there. And you can see this on these fermentations here as well. So you have the deltas and the asterisks, which recommend where there was a statistically significant difference. And we're going to explain this more later. But again, broken down even further, you have the Minimize. The fruity, the floral, the sulfury are all pretty. On sulfury down here, you have a 1 is the lowest, and the highest is a 2, right? For fruity, the lowest is a 3, the highest is a 4. Like there's a very flat, consistent performance across all these. Now, here's the interesting one. I think this is a lot of interesting, relevant information for why this is all important. So, as you can see here, you have a red line and a green line. So, this tells you the frequency that descriptors detected, that sensory panel is detected a compound. So, as you can see, diacetyl was detected at about, I don't know, 66% of the time on this red one, which is the C11, and about 40% of the time on this green one. And then you had DMS specifically, out of the sulfur compounds, these are H2S and all that, was detected about 33% on the red one, right? Now this is the C1 and the C11 fermentations. Now what's interesting about these, there's two things to know here. We did not do a diacetyl rest, and we did not do a forced diacetyl test before stopping these fermentations. So for the sake of scientific consistency, all these fermentations are held for, I think for lagers is 5 days at this when it's a steady gravity, and then it's just crashed. That's it. No tests for diacetyl, nothing. Um, and and no increase in temp either. But as you can see, the coldest fermentations with the lowest pitch rates are the ones that had these issues. So this C11 was done at 54 Fahrenheit, 12 Celsius. Sorry, 54 Fahrenheit, 12 Celsius, 12 Plato, and 25 grams per hectoliter pitch rate. That's the lowest pitch rate in our study here. I mean, we recommend for pitching at 12C, you should be pitching closer to 100 grams per hectoliter. So that's about a quarter of our pitch rate. And the other one was also 12C, and the second lowest pitch rate that we recommend, which is that we did in the study, not that we recommend, which is the 50 grams per hectoliter. That was at 16 Plato. So, I would hypothesize that given enough time, these fermentations would have cleared up diacetyl. I think it would have taken longer than 5 days, but at the minimum, you can see that at a colder temperature and a lower pitch rate, you're just going to need more time, right? And the other thing you'll notice is the DMS. That's also not too surprising, considering that these are the coldest fermentations with the lowest pitch rates, because DMS is very volatile and it's volatilized in fermentation. So I would expect a warmer fermentation with more yeast to be more volatile and to volatilize more of that DMS precursor and DMS compound. So overall, this is actually pretty expected. And I think it just shows too that if you look at the other 12C fermentations that had more yeast, right? Or the ones that were done at warmer temperatures with the same amount of yeast, you didn't have these issues. So out of the 14, only the 2 were there. So it could be argued that doing a colder, one of the most common questions I've answered since starting with Fermentis has been, it's been 2.5 years now, and people ask me, oh, I didn't have enough yeast. So I didn't have enough in the brewery, so I pitched colder than normal, and that's probably the opposite of what you want to do, as far as it goes, because we're going to get into the kinetic side of it. You're going to get a slower fermentation, and you actually increase your chance of having off flavors. As you remember from, and if you see here on the sensory and on the analytical side, there's little to no difference in esters and higher alcohols between these fermentations, but a diacetyl spike is definitely something you'd want to avoid. So, all right, I think that is the conclusion for part 1. Higher volatile production, so esters and higher alcohols increased with gravity or density, but had little sensory impact overall. And lower fermentation temperatures really increased the risk of off flavors in the slow fermentation. We're get to sorry, losing my voice there. We're gonna get into the slow fermentation part next. Okay. Anybody have? Cool. Everybody nod if you're good.
I saw there. I think there's a question in the chat about hydrating yeast prior to pitch or just pitching it dry straight in.
Okay, yeah. That one I'll save to the end, just because it's not really on this topic, but I'll happily answer that at the end. But typically we recommend pitching directly into the wort, and I'll get into the details as to why that, but towards the end. But I just want to make sure you guys get that. So overall, really, as far as sensory goes, 14 different fermentations. honestly, most of these done outside of what most brewers would do, and even outside of our recommendations, and still got pretty consistent sensory results. And then, at the minimum, an increased diacetyl rest time needed. Um, so, an increased risk of diacetyl and sulfur off flavors as well in those slower, colder fermentations. So now we're moving to fermentative performance, right? Because you might be asking yourself, well, that's cool. Like I could do just about anything and still make a lager with this yeast, but how can I make this work for me, right? Well, here you're going to see some interesting data. So as always, big chart, it'll get reduced down, but this is just an overview. So you have all the fermentations here, and they're 20, 16, and 12 Plato fermentations. These are the starting gravity. Bottom axis, the x-axis is the time of the fermentation. So you have the shortest one at 96 hours or 4 days. The longest one was 456 hours, I think it is. I can't see because of the screen here. And that was 19 days. But yeah, we're going to break these down. And remember, when you look at these are all the 12 Plato fermentations. So just keep in mind, this 12 Plato, just look at the temperature and the pitch rate, right? So here you can see you have your shortest fermentation was 96 hours. Your longest was 240. I mean, you're already talking about that's more than double, right? The fermentation timeline for that one. Now, that longest one is 240 hours. That was the 12 Plato, 12 Celsius, 25 gram per hectoliter pitch rate. That should sound familiar because that C11 is this one right here in that red. That's that same beer. That was also the longest fermentation. So the shortest one is the 12 Plato, 20 Celsius, which is 68 Fahrenheit, and 50 gram per hectoliter. So we can see here, even going up to 100 grams per hectoliter, only, that fermentation doesn't even make sense. It's like we couldn't even explain it when we did the study because it was the same temperature as the other one, but double the pitch rate and was longer. But sometimes these things happen, and we just present the results. That's all we can do. The C12 is an interesting one. It's 16 Celsius and the same pitch rate as the 50 over here. You can see it's already almost twice as long. This gets more interesting when you get into the 16 Plato and 20 Plato because, as you guys know, as brewers, things tend to be exaggerated as gravity goes up. So here, looking at these 16 Plato fermentations, your shortest are 120. You have two overlapping fermentations here, the blue one and the green one. That's 16. These are all 16 Plato, so I'm just going to tell you Celsius. So that's the 20 Celsius and 50 grams per hectoliter, and 20 Celsius and 100 grams per hectoliter. So doubling the pitch rate still resulted in the same fermentation time. Yeah, I don't, at that temperature. Now, what's interesting is when you look at, for example, this is 25 grams per hectoliter. This really long fermentation here, that's a 16, 12, and 50 grams per hectoliter, right? That C1 should look familiar too, because that is this one right here, that green one. So that longer fermentation also resulted in, more chance of an off flavor. So, I mean, as a brewer, right, I think that if you're looking at a risk assessment and you say, hey, like, I could pitch colder and ferment at a colder temperature, I'm more likely to have off flavors and my fermentation is going to take 3 times as long. I don't know if the risk to reward ratio is there from a production standpoint. Maybe there's things that you're looking to do, like you have a very traditionalist approach and you're making a Czech style lager and you want, I don't know, an increased amount of hints of diacetyl and hint of sulfur, all power to you, right? But as far as fermentation performance and optimizing kinetics and minimizing off flavors, it's just, I would argue it's just there's a very high risk, low reward kind of scenario here. 20 Plato is very interesting too. Same story here. All the fermentations got longer, of course, because they're higher gravity. This one I use a lot because I work with a lot of brewers that are making like malt beverages and doing high alcohol fermentations. And it's fascinating to me that, the shortest fermentation here, these are all 20 Plato, right, is 20 Celsius and 50 grams per hectoliter. Now, pitching 100 and 200 grams per hectoliter at 16 Celsius resulted in a longer fermentation. So you had a shorter fermentation at 20 C, even at, half the pitch rate and a quarter of the pitch rate of this. And even more interestingly, if you look at this longest fermentation, I think that is the C13, no, C14, sorry. That is also 20 Plato. That's the 12 Celsius and 100 grams per hectoliter. So you can cut your pitch rate in half, right? And just go up 4 degrees Celsius and cut your fermentation timeline in half, which is it's a significant difference, right? But quadrupling your pitch rate won't make your fermentation the same or even shorter. That's the way I like to look at this. I don't know. That's if you look at this fermentation here, the C13, that's a 25 gram per hectoliter pitch rate. Like I would not recommend that. 20 Plato and 16C, but even that performed better than 12 Celsius and 100 grams per hectoliter as far as fermentation kinetics go. And none of these fermentations were off flavor, on the sensory panel. And looking at some of these again on the ester side, they're all pretty flat performance. So yeah, I think I don't know. It's something I like to say as a yeast supplier that you don't have to buy as much yeast and you can get better results. And at the end of the day, I'm a brewer like you guys. So but yeah, quadrupling the fermentation here did not result in a better performance than just pitching at a warmer temperature. So there you go. Here's some correlation charts. Here's your, well, the first one is as gravity goes up, the length of the fermentation went up. And you guys know how correlation charts works. Like 0.5 is it's a pretty weak correlation. And it goes to show because what's really important is your temperature. So here's gravity going up, right? You have a weak correlation with the increase in fermentation time. But the decrease in fermentation time, the negative correlation is moderately strong with temperature. So 20 Celsius ferments much faster. So and you saw that in my explanation on 20 Plato. There's a bigger impact in shortening your fermentation timeline by using temperature than by using more yeast. That's the best way I could put it. Now, I don't even know why this is here. It's pretty funny though. As gravity goes up, ethanol goes up. Cool. There's some more correlations here that are really fun to dig into. You can find this presentation online. I could send it to you. This is going to be recorded, but these are fun to dig into too. And you can see it's probably not enough time for today, but you can see how specific compounds correlated. And I wouldn't take this as gospel. It's just one study, just like anything else scientific based. But it's a pretty good study. And we do supply the majority of the world's breweries, and 3470 is the most popular strain. So we have a lot of user feedback as well. So it holds up. Now, here's a very interesting correlation. This is just a 100 gram per hectoliter pitch rates. And you can see a very strong, almost one correlation of as temperature went up, your fermentation went down. So when you pitch at our recommended pitch rate, like you really have good results as far as kinetics when your temperature goes up. So I think it covered pretty much all of this. So overall, my takeaways and what I like to talk to people about here is if you're fermenting at a colder temperature with 3470, and so it's weird when I can't see your faces. There we go. I don't like talking to myself. It's you probably have a lot of opportunity to speed up your fermentations to produce beer faster. And why is that important, right? Well, if our fermentations take 6 weeks, let's say 3 weeks, and you cut them all down to 2 weeks, you just increase your capacity of your brew house with the same equipment by 33%. That's the total you can produce in a year, right? And with the study, you could also see that you probably decrease your chances of certain off flavors as well. So maybe you're not in a situation where you need to worry about your production schedules like that. You have plenty of fermenter capacity. It's great, good for you. But if you do, this is something that you can use. Other ways that it could be used is a lot of people are using 3470 for West Coast IPAs now. You can pitch it at 20°C, 68 Fahrenheit, and just let it rock. And I've talked to a lot of really good brewers who are doing that. And there's been some podcasts that we've done online with guest brewers and stuff. Yeah, that's a popular use. Another thing I answer a question a lot about is high pressure fermentation. And I don't mean pressure in the sense of like spunding. I mean high pressure fermentation in the sense where like macrobrewery type, where you might add pressure to suppress ester formation and be able to ferment at a warmer temperature and produce beer faster. Now, yeast doesn't like pressure in general. So what I usually recommend people to do is to slowly increase their fermentation temperature and see where they hit that top limit. Because you know, I had actually when I was at the Florida Brewers Conference, somebody called me and was asking me about fermentation. It was the first time they had ever used 3470 or lager yeast. They were making all their lagers with Kvike strains before. And they were wondering if they could ferment at those higher temperatures. I was like, honestly, try it first with the lager yeast, get some batches in, slowly increase your temperature methodically as you feel comfortable, and you might not find the need to add the pressure, and you always can if you will. If you go up like a degree Celsius or two, you're not going to take your beer from 0 to hero, right? So, and even if you have an established fermentation profile now, I think it'd probably benefit you to pitch at a slightly warmer temp, maybe step it up and halfway through fermentation to a higher temp. In general, the most conservative lager fermentation I give people when trying out their lager strains for the first time is one that I used for a long time, and it's the most conservative one I give. It's pitch about 100 grams per hectoliter at 54 Fahrenheit, ferment at 56. At 50 to 66% attenuation, bump it up to 61, 62, and let it rock. And you're going to get a faster diacetyl cleanup time by stepping it up. We didn't do that in these fermentations because, again, the goal with these studies is not to make good beer. It's to analyze these strains and to see how they perform in different conditions by isolating as many variables as possible. So, yeah, I would typically recommend something like that. Things that this study didn't cover is dry hops, and it's just one study at the end of the day. But overall, I think that there's a lot of kind of valuable information here in how to optimize your fermentations. And it kind of goes to show that I think that especially with this might not apply to all lager strains, right? We know we have other characterization studies coming out for other strains, but for 3470, I mean, it just, you can't beat it when it comes to producing a neutral beer. It just delivers. So, and honestly, the few times that I've run into people having issues with 3470, 99% of the time I've tracked it down to their pitch temp was too cold and they pitched too little yeast, often both. That usually runs into fermentations. So it runs into fermentation problems. And we didn't test below 12C here. I've done some fermentations personally with at 8C, pitching at 8C, more classical. And I think it's possible you might get more sulfur in those kinds of situations. But here you didn't really see that. I think you probably just get it past threshold there. But yeah, I don't know. I think I think I covered everything. I don't. Do you guys have any questions on this? And maybe I could do those like verbal questions if you have any off the top of your head that you didn't ask, and then I could answer all the other ones in the chat after.
No, quick question.
Yeah.
Not necessarily related to this topic, but what if we go like 3 or 4 generations? We're not going to harvest forever on this guy. We're just going to do a couple because it's so cheap to do just throw in a brick. Let's say, I love 2nd generation, 3rd generation to harvest and go that far. Do you guys have any evidence, even be it anecdotal, that it stays neutral, or that does it start getting some nuanced characteristics, or does fermentation speed up or slow down?
So I only have anecdotal information on that. I can tell you from my personal experience and from a lot of people, 3470 just gets faster. Gen 2, Gen 3, Gen 4. I used to harvest it, and I typically, and I think, Todd, you guys do the same thing, harvested at terminal gravity. And I always got great results there. Viability was always 96% at least. Letting it sit in the cone, it could drop a bit. I think a lot of that has to do with your harvesting practices, and it's how pure you can keep the fermentation and the strain and the culture. But overall, it's a really neutral strain, so I wouldn't expect it to drift genetically. A lot of people I work with go 11, 12 gen even. I've heard of more. I don't typically recommend that because you're going to get some drift, but what is it going to drift to? It's not going to turn into Hefeweizen yeast after like 5 gen, right? So I think that it's a really consistent performer. And then yeah, performance gets faster, and that's been anecdotally my experience, and a lot of brewers I talk to. It just gets better at cleaning up diacetyl, and finish fermentation like a day or two earlier. I remember pitching at 54. And we did warmer fermentations, but the beer I brewed in Miami at the tank was La Plaita, and we had that core beer. We'd harvest it at terminal gravity. We'd repitch it, and I was worried at first that I'd be selecting for the cells that dropped out of solution earlier, or that didn't attenuate as much, or didn't clean up the acetal. But in practice, all of our fermentations were numbers wise identical, and they were performing faster. So I mean that's like the best of both worlds. So that's my personal experience. I did see drops in viability if stored in the cone, and that's why I started landing on harvesting at terminal. And I often recommend that for brewers to at least try it to see if it works, because the earlier you grab the yeast, the better viability is going to be. If it's just stored in the cone, no nutrients, kind of just hanging out, it's probably not going to be the best shape by the time you're done. So I don't know. Does that answer your question? Any other questions other than the ones in the chat?
Mo, were you saying that all of these trials were with no oxygen to the wort?
Yes. Yes, that's a very important thing to. So, um, oxygen is used by yeast to synthesize sterols for the cell walls. Now, part of the drying process of yeast involves maximizing how much sterols are stored in their cell walls before drying, so they survive the drying process. And with our yeast strains pitched at a normal gravity, let's say 12 to 16 Plato, and our recommended pitch rates, you actually will get multiple replications without any additional air or O2, and you'll get through fermentation just fine. And every single study that we do is done without oxygen, just direct pitched into, wort that was not aerated or oxygenated. Now, you harvest and repitch, for sure, you have to add oxygen. And at that point, I would urge you to, I mean, again, I'm not even saying that you shouldn't add air and oxygen, because I think that there's likely a difference. But kinetically and sensory wise, in a normal gravity beer, you should be able to get through fermentation just fine. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to not add oxygen as well. I just think that there's probably some differences as far as total cell growth and potentially, and this is all hypothetical, potentially even sensory characteristics. Like, for example, if you had a Hefeweizen and you oxygenated it like crazy, I think you might get less esters and more cell growth and, things like that. So I think there could be differences. So I think really the key would be to match your sensory and kinetics. But again, like a strain like 3470, it's going to be neutral. So I've never heard anybody complain that they ruin their beer by adding too much oxygen with dry pitch, right? But then again, it'd be very difficult for a brewer to measure if there was some Strecker aldehyde reactions or oxidation precursors that were created. And, you are oxidizing your wort at some level by adding oxygen. So it's a broad answer, but I would say that the appropriate amount of oxygen to add is the minimum that is necessary to achieve your goals. And that might take some experimentation to find out. But yes, we did no oxygen on any of these. No increase in temperature during fermentation, no diacetyl rest increase. And that just helps us keep it very consistent. And there's a lot of people that go oxygen free. I personally experimented with that. I never had a problem. At the minimum, I would recommend adding less on a dry pitch than you do on a liquid pitch, for sure. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
Cool.
I guess if that's okay.
Yeah, please. I'm here all day, so I have nothing else scheduled today.
Have you heard much about brewers? We practice this, and I guess it allows us to reduce our pitch rate a little bit, because we do ferment pretty cool. Like, we're usually in the high 40s, low 50s, but we usually pitch at ale temperatures. Like, we knock out, we'll pitch at ale temp, let it sit overnight at like 60 Fahrenheit. And then once we start to see activity is when we actually go to our primary fermentation temperature. Have you heard of that practice much?
Yeah, I've heard of it a few times. Actually, when I started, I was pretty surprised. It's actually relatively common. So when I first started, I was like, why would you do that? And because I was never a big believer in it. I always preferred increasing temperature rather than decreasing. But enough people are doing it successfully where I've like opened up my mind to it. I'm not sure. I don't have any data on this, and we don't have any studies on it. I do have a lot of people telling me it's working for them, so that's great. Personally, I'm still leaning towards I would pitch colder and let it ramp up. I think yeast just prefers that. Um, Maybe pitching at that warmer temperature is almost like a band-aid for pitching less yeast, I want to say, right? Because you by pitching more yeast at a colder temperature, I mean, I get it, guys, yeast costs money, but I think that's just even more of an argument to use 3470, just pitch it at that warmer temperature, right? And at the minimum, even if you're in that situation, let's say you're pitching at, I don't know, 61 Fahrenheit, which was the temperature in this study. Instead of dropping it down to 12C or 54, maybe just drop it down to 58 next time and see what happens. You're like, oh, it works great. And then, you're gonna turn around and you're gonna tell me, oh, hey, we just cut our fermentation in half by just keeping it at the same temperature and not dropping it, and our beer tastes fine. So, I would probably recommend doing that. I could tell you guys a funny anecdotal story where we had a fermentation shoot up to 73 Fahrenheit, and this was not day one. We had set the tank on a Friday on the pills, 54. The brewer didn't do anything wrong except they had set to heat, not cool, which is like, the kind of shit that happens in a brewery. And we didn't have heating, of course, but there's nothing to control the fermentation. So over the weekend, 36-hour lag phase, and Monday I come in and labs running up to me like, boom, that thing skyrocketed, right? And it just shot up. I was like, all right, this beer's screwed. So I told him, all right, let's finish it up. We'll let it finish out. Don't worry, accidents happen. We brew another batch, and I went to taste the fermentation after, and I couldn't really tell much of a difference, right, on our core beer. And we did triangle tests, and we were really struggling to pick it out. We ended up blending it anyways, but there was nothing wrong with that beer. It was a perfectly good lager. So now that was pitched at 54 and rose to 73, right? So I don't know. I'm not saying you should go and just do that right away in all beers, but start moving up a few degrees here and there and see what happens. I do have a hunch that the first few days of fermentation are probably the most important, even for like diacetyl cleanup. Like, for example, I don't think that pitching at 12C and then bumping it up to 20C later, right, will clean up diacetyl as fast as just pitching it at even 16C and bumping it up and holding it there or bumping it up to 20, right? I don't know. There's something to look into there, but I think that those first initial days are very important as far as yeast growth and metabolism and eliminating lag phase, and I think it leads into a faster diacetyl cleanup and terminal gravity and all that long term. So, does that answer your question? Ooh, all right. Who else? Keep hitting me with them, please.
I think I saw JJ had thrown in the chat about that rehydrating versus just direct pitch dry.
Yeah. So
Final product.
So we actually that was when I was still brewing. I remember when Fermentis changed their recommendations on that. I was the one guy that was, sounds like maybe there's multiple of us that was still rehydrating and doing it. But Fermentis did a deep dive into it, and it was actually based on brewer feedback. And brewers were telling them that they were getting perfectly good results by just pitching it direct. So they did a whole study on it. And what we found is that you actually get better viability pitching at those straight into wort. We did a bunch of different temperatures and gravities. I think it went up as high as 20 Plato. And I think the hypothesis as to why you get better results is that it more closely replicates the osmotic pressure that's upon yeast from when it was dried in the propagator. So in the propagator, it was in a solution that contained sugar, it had a certain amount of osmotic pressure, and then by pitching it in the wort gravity, you just got better results. So yeah, you'll get like a good 8 to 10%, maybe 5 to 10% difference in viability by pitching into wort versus water. So that's good to know, I think. So yeah, it's pitching into water is more work. It's another vector or potential for contamination, and you get poor results. So I absolutely would not recommend it. The one time you do want to rehydrate, I think there might be something said for like if you're making some sort of kettle sour. I don't have any information on this, but I do wonder sometimes if maybe it'd be better to rehydrate straight into wort before putting into that sour beer, or to rehydrate it, even water. I don't know. That would take some experimentation, but it's a hunch. And then for re-fermentation of bottle conditioned beverages, like for example, our bottle conditioning strains, Do not rehydrate directly into, I mean, it'll get the job done, but you won't get the best results. When we found that if you rehydrate in a solution that contains ethanol, you don't get good results. You get better results by rehydrating water. So for our re-fermentation strains, we don't recommend that. And actually, on this screen here, you guys see this E2U symbol that's here. I don't know if you guys can. That anything that has that on it is basically we tested it for direct pitching, so it's certified, I guess, by us to be used that way. So yeah, and the other thing that's incredibly important is agitation. You want to keep minimal agitation when you're rehydrating the first 30 minutes. That could impact your viability by 10% easily. We did some studies on like shaker plates where we did no agitation, moderate, and then vigorous agitation. And then we saw a difference there in the first 30 minutes. And the reason for that is when the yeast is in its dry form, the cell walls are hard. They're very brittle. They're not like soft. So when you agitate them, you can actually rupture them. So you actually, like I wouldn't, for example, put yeast into a liquid and then run it through a centrifugal pump straight into a tank, right? Like you definitely want to give it like a good 30 minutes. In general, you don't want to beat up yeast, and if you're going to, like, be as gentle with it as possible, and then definitely do it at least 20 to 30 minutes after, before you do that. That's my recommendation, Fermentis' recommendation there. Does that answer those questions on that, JJ? All right. Is there any, let me see, I don't even know how to see the chat if there's any more questions. Oh, wait, here? No, that's subtitles. Paloma, can you tell me if there's any more questions? Or
There's not any more questions. If you want, you can close your screen and you can see all of our
I don't know.
faces.
Oh yeah, that'd be so much better. You do
Your
that.
share screen, yeah.
Stop share. That's better. Yeah, it's weird to talk to just a blank screen. I kept opening up my tab just to see a face, a friendly face. Cool. Is there any other questions? Hey Todd, how did you ask the question? Or it's like you teleported here. Yeah. Hey, if you guys have any other questions on actually, I wouldn't mind telling you guys about something. So 3470 is obviously our most popular strain. It's the most popular lager strain in the world, not just by us. I mean, we sell the vast majority of it, but I mean, it's a huge part of our production. We have 4 other lager strains. So we have 3 other that are available currently and 1 coming out. 3470, I think, is the go-to for making a neutral lager consistently. I mean, I always joke, it's never the wrong choice. Like, you can make any beer style you want with 3470, right? You can even make any lager style. You can make any, even like West Coast IPAs. But if you're looking for something different, there's a reason we have other strains, right? So we have our S23, for example, is a little bit more estery. It produces a little more isoamyl acetate, not a lot. All of our strains, all of our lager strains produce primarily isoamyl acetate in increasing levels. So with 3470, it's just basically neutral. At 23, you get a little more. You get a little more that doesn't taste like banana. You get like fruitiness, right? It tends to really accentuate malt character. When we do our comparative studies, the number one that always pops up to the top for really accentuating malt and malt sweetness and almost gives you an impression of like being less attenuated, but it's not. It's actually the same attenuation as S23. A close second to that for malt is actually 3470. It does tend to accentuate malt a lot. We also have S189. That's a very nice strain. It's very it really accentuates like herbal and floral hop characteristics. I think like a German Pils. It puts out these very floral esters. Very nice strain. Neutral overall in the ester profile, like 3470, but has a more floral note than a fruity note. Consistently in our consistently in our comparisons, we get that herbal floral character out of that. It's really nice. I talked to quite a few brewers in Florida that have started experimenting with that. E30 is a very nice strain too. It's very fruity. That one you get a tiny hint of banana. It's a lot of isoamyl acetate, about twice as much as all the other strains. It's a very nice strain though. Like they did a comparative one here with their Cristal beer La Tropical. They did an E30 and 3471, and I really like that E30 one. It was nice. If you're trying to make like a macro type lager, like a Coors Banquet type, Coors Banquet, Heineken, both those beers, they have that banana note. It's a very common character in macro lagers because the average drinker really enjoys that character. As craft beer nerds, we we turned up our nose to that for a long time. We're like, no, lager's supposed to be clean, supposed to be neutral. That's a sign of a good brewer who didn't make any mistakes. A lot of brewers are starting to experiment outside of that now. They want a little more character. And on the macro side, I mean, the average consumer just loves fruitiness. There's a reason all these seltzers are popular. So it doesn't surprise me at all to see the specs of some of these macro lagers and how much isoamyl acetate they have. And then the last one we have coming is SH45. That's in the pipeline. I tasted it for the first time a couple months ago. Very interesting strain. It releases a lot of thiols from precursors. It's not a GMO strain, it's just a natural yeast strain that does that, like other strains that do it. But what's interesting, ooh, thank you, sir. What's this?
E30.
E30. Nice. Thank you. Cheers. Yeah. So what's interesting about time I got a beer in this place. So what's interesting about what was I saying? About SH45 is most of our lager strains and ale strains release cystine-related bound precursor thiols or thiols from cystine bound precursors. SH45 releases them from glutathione-related bound precursors, which are by far the most abundant in beer wort. So you have a high potential for releasing a lot of thiols, and it can also esterify them. So why that's important is you might have, for example, 3MH is a very common thiol in beer. It's that passion fruit character. And then some strains like our 04 and I think our BE256 and S33 can convert that 3MH additionally to 3MHA. And that has a threshold that's 10 times lower. So that means basically you need 10 times less to get the same flavor impact from that esterified form than the normal form. So yeah, that SH45 is going to be a fun strain too. So yeah, we have other strains out there. A lot of brewers that we work with are, maybe using 3470 for the bulk of their production, but they might have one strain for something else or vice versa, right? So yeah, that's something I wanted to put out there too. So there's a lot of variety in the lager world, and we have a lot of lager strains and more coming. Cool. Any more questions?
Thank you, Mo. I put your email on the chat if anybody needs
Perfect.
it. I'm sure they have your contact, but just in case.
Maybe not. Yeah. If you guys were too shy to ask a question or thought about something later, just shoot me. That's what I'm here for, I mean, technically my talent sales, but most of what I do is support, answering questions, and so that's at least the part I like. I don't get to brew anymore, so I do it vicariously through all of you.
We have to
cool.
make a beer together.
Yes, Florida Brewers Guild collab for next
All
year
right.
if it's held in Miami. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mo.
Thanks for
Thank you,
stopping by.
guys.
Yeah, reach out if you have any questions. Thank you guys. Have a nice day.
Thanks,
Bye.
Mo.